Welcome to our second session for today, a session entitled, Can the Renewable Sector Coexist with the Fossil Fuels Industry? So the fossil fuels industry has come under increasing scrutiny and criticism in recent years, while the renewable sector has gained more prominence mainly because of the negative effects that emissions from the fossil fuel sector has on climate patterns. But since the debate on climate change is a widely contested political issue, this has often obscured fact and truth regarding the actual impact of the fossil fuels industry and the extent to which the renewable sector is an immediate and realistic alternative all over the world that would completely replace the fossil fuels industry. So this conversation brings together two experts on the subject who are going to discuss the extent to which the two energy sectors can coexist and the future of energy policies in general in the United States and beyond. So this affords us an opportunity to learn with a more in-depth approach all the different aspects of energy policy and climate change and the different ways in which climate change can be mitigated and the different stakeholders who can come together to address all the different issues to do with the climate that we're facing today. So I'm excited to introduce to you our speakers. So I'll begin with Dr. Todd Moss. He's the founder and executive director of the Energy for Growth Hub. He's also a visiting fellow at the Center for Global Development and a non-resident scholar at the Center for Energy Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute, and a fellow at the Colorado School of Mines Payne Institute. Previously, Todd served as U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, the Chief Operating Officer of the Center for Global Development, and has also worked at the London School of Economics, Georgetown University, the World Bank, and the EIU. Is that the Economic Intelligence Unit?
Yes.
He is a widely recognized expert on energy, development finance, and foreign policy, who has also testified at the US Congress 10 times. Todd is the author of African Development, Making Sense of the Issues and Actors, the three different editions, 2007, 2011, and 2018, and Oil to Cash, Fighting the Resource Curse with Cash Transfers, published in 2015. Todd holds a PhD and MSc from the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies, and a BA from Tufts University here in Boston. In the early mornings, Todd also writes international political thrillers. So you need to get some of his fiction works as well. So help me welcome Dr. Todd Moss. And I'm happy to introduce to you my good friend Nadege Compaore, who flew in from cold Toronto, colder than it is here, I'm sure. Nadege Compaore is a Provost Post-Doctoral Fellow in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto, where she is also affiliated with the Environmental Governance Lab at the Monk School of Global Affairs. She received a PhD in Political Studies from Queen's University, where her research on the global governance of oil revenues was informed by extensive fieldwork in Gabon, Ghana, and South Africa. It was funded by national grants such as the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the Center for International Governance Innovation, and the Canadian International Development Agency. Her work lies at the intersection of international relations, natural resource politics, African politics, as well as gender and race in global politics. She is the co-editor of New Approaches to the Governance of Natural Resources, Insights from Africa, and is published by Palgrave. And her work has also been published in journals such as International Studies Review, Etude Internationale, Millennium, Journal of International Studies and Contemporary Politics. Nadege is a fellow at the Center for International Defense and Policy, and she currently serves on two boards, the Canadian Association of African Studies and Women in International Security Canada. Nadege Compaore, everybody. So without further ado, I'm going to call upon Nadege to go first.
Thank you very much, Shingi, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's my first time at Wellesley. I've always wanted to actually be here, so I've had a quick tour. A lot of my friends came here for undergrad, so I have to tell them that I made a quick visit today. So I'm looking forward to engaging with my fellow panelists and with all of you today on what I think is an urgently needed conversation. So the question we've been asked to address is whether the renewable sector can coexist with the fossil fuel industry. My answer is, in the long term, no. And this statement inevitably needs a follow-up. Essentially, the goal of my remarks here will be to address why this coexistence is not possible in the long term and what we can do about it. Admittedly, it's a very ambitious goal, so it's really going to be a trigger for what I hope is going to be an engaging discussion. So in the next 15 to 20 minutes, that I'm not going to time myself, so feel free to tell me if I'm running out of time. My remarks will expand on one main proposition, which is that we should move beyond the thinking of a coexistence and instead focus on developing the renewable sector further with the ultimate goal of achieving decarbonization. And my thinking here is informed by existing work from many experts in the field. Shingi mentioned the Environmental Governance Lab at the University of Toronto. Well, because technically it's with the Monk School of Global Affairs, which is very entrenched with the University of Toronto. And I've been a postdoc there only since July. And a lot of the work there is really gearing towards the issue of decarbonization. How is it possible? Why? And so I am really resting on the shoulder of a lot of work that's being done already to bring us into this conversation. I also want to stress that this status quo that I want to talk about is not being perpetrated by anyone out there, but by all of us. So it's not just a matter of having big, powerful institutions being responsible for climate change as we continue to consume an unprecedented amount of fossil fuel energy in our daily lives. So for instance, coming here from Toronto, a plane, it's something that I really need to rethink about in the future if we want to really have a serious conversation about how to achieve decarbonization. But I wanted to first start on this note because I'm very guilty of helping perpetrate the state of affairs that I'm about to denounce. But before we go further, I'm not sure how familiar everybody is with this debate. I just thought we could have a quick overview of why we have this debate right now in the first place. So fossil fuels contribute the largest share of energy production, with 74% of global electricity production coming from fossil energy. And these statistics are from the Global Energy Statistical Yearbook 2019. This comes for the most part from oil, primarily, then from gas, but also from coal. And energy from fossil fuels have fundamentally transformed the world. This is since the Industrial Revolution, of course. And we've never had such a powerful and efficient source of energy at this scale and magnitude. So we can understand why we all love to be convenient and to have access to the energy that we have right now. But this powerful and convenient source of energy is not without serious drawbacks. And I want to highlight 4 top issues resulting from fossil fuels use. And the first is climate change, given that fossil fuels contribute the most to greenhouse gas emissions. Air pollution from the use of fossil fuel energy, especially in urban spaces, is a big issue as well. And oil spills in the transportation of extracted oil, for instance, leaves devastating environmental consequences, which are often catastrophic, as do other extractive mechanisms, which leads to ecological destruction. And last but not least, there's the issue of depletion. Fossil fuels are not renewable, which means that once extracted and used, they're not replenishable. So in this context, debates in global environmental politics have prioritized the issue of fossil fuel exacerbating climate change as the most urgent one to address, and many have identified decarbonization as a path forward. And we can discuss further whether people agree with this prioritization or not, obviously, in the Q&A. So does this mean that renewables are automatically the best alternative relative to fossil fuels? Well, renewables, as the name suggests, have the major advantage of being replenishable. And we can find renewable energy in various forms, notably in wind power, solar power, geothermal, biomass, and hydropower. What I'd like to focus on is the fact that renewables have much less impact on exacerbating climate change through greenhouse gas emissions. And this is where I think the need for renewables is evident in the path towards decarbonization. Renewable energy still remains one of the least used forms of energy, however, at 26% of global energy electricity production. And this is from the same statistics that I quoted earlier for the fossil fuels. And in addition to its small supply, there are other important challenges that the renewable sector faces. First, they can be intermittent. For instance, solar energy can only be harnessed with the sun. Wind power, obviously when the wind is blowing, and this varies greatly around the world depending on the various resources that are available. But also they are often too expensive to transition to, in addition to taking a very long time to install. And by expensive, I'm not just talking about the financial cost, but also the socio-political cost that this comes with. For instance, Germany is the first country in the world with a binding agreement to exit coal and nuclear energy. Germany plans to completely phase out coal and nuclear by 2038, very long time to do so, and will cost 40 billion euros, about 44 billion US dollars, to compensate affected states, affected companies, and some individuals. And it's important to note that this expensive transition will also have political costs for the actors that are pushing this forward, and this can be seen in a voting power, public opinion, etc., etc. And finally, perhaps one of the biggest drawbacks that people sort of pushing against the issue of renewables versus fossil fuels will point out to is the fact that renewables also have some ecological consequences, some negative ecological consequences. For instance, the construction of dams for hydropower or wind turbines for wind power, or even using biomass, often lead to the destruction of animal and plant habitat. Still, while the renewable sector is far from perfect, I want to argue that it's by far the better alternative, and we should move towards it as a replacement to fossil fuels because of the climate change impact of fossil energy. So my argument makes three propositions. First, as I mentioned, the coexistence between fossil fuels and renewables is not sustainable in the long term. So the more sustainable path being a decarbonizing path, which requires a complete shift away from fossil fuels. Second, a long-term shift away from fossil fuels will require a global approach rather than a siloed approach, specifically looking at national initiatives or even regional initiatives. We have, for instance, the EU with a commendable initiative of reaching carbon neutral levels by 2050. But what does that mean for implications with other actors in the international system, with the United States, for instance, with China, or even thinking about recent Brexit dynamics? What would that mean for those that are in Europe but not part of the European Union? And third, this long-term approach needs to be fully transformative, and to do so we need an interdisciplinary approach, one that brings together the combined expertise of individuals and institutions from environmental scientists, economists, sociologists, scientists, political scientists, historians, technologists, etc., etc. So let's look at this proposition a bit more closely. Why decarbonization? Fossil fuels are contributing to the climate crisis at a deeply alarming state. So in 2018 alone, 37.1 billion tons of carbon emissions came from fossil fuel use. And this crisis, therefore, requires immediate attention. And yet the status quo is hard to change for all of us, because fossil fuels are prominent, extremely profitable, and extremely entrenched into the modes of lives of everyone. So there's a profound structural, socio-economic, political, technological change needed. The idea of renewables and fossil fuels coexisting speaks to this status quo and to two things. First, the recognition that fossil fuels are a serious issue for the climate and renewables can be a way forward, but also two, the fact that we are not willing to live without fossil fuels. What this compromise means is an acceptance of the status quo, which expresses the desire for change, but without actual clear plans to enact this change and make it last. And now here's the core reason why I argue, alongside many global environmental politics scholars, that decarbonization efforts should be radical rather than a compromise. Let's take a look, for instance, at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that has warned in their special report from October 2018 that we must limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius if we are to prevent further climate change disasters, rising sea levels, extreme temperatures. And to achieve the 1.5 Celsius limit would require changes that are rapid and far-reaching. And these are radical changes that involve, and I quote, transitions in land, energy, industry, buildings, transport, and cities. So global net human-caused emissions of carbon dioxide would need to fall by about 45% from the 2010 levels by 2030. So it's not that long from now. And reaching net zero around 2050. And that explains why the European Union goal is to be carbon neutral by 2050. So this means that any remaining emissions would need to be balanced by removing CO2 from the air altogether. So that means the decarbonization effect that we're talking about. This is why in the long term we need a global and globalized approach to climate change if we want it to be impactful in the long term. The long-term approach away from fossil fuels must be a global approach, and as an international relations scholar, my inclination is to look towards global cooperation as a path to solving this issue. And I take a global approach to this question rather than centralize or isolate players such as the US in my discussion, because this is fundamentally a global issue, notwithstanding the fact that such players are key players in the international system. And there has not been a shortage of these global agreements. Most notably, everyone knows about the Kyoto Protocol signed in 1997, effective in 2005, or the 2015 Paris Agreement, which now the US has withdrawn from. However, there have also been serious setbacks in terms of the actual implementation of these agreements. So how to move forward and how do we get from initiatives to concrete action? And that's the real question, which is addressed, I mentioned two authors here who are both actually at the Environmental Governance Lab. I promise they actually not, getting me to promote this work, but I think it was very important to mention it in this context because this piece is an academic piece in Nature Climate Change, but they've just published a non-academic piece in The Conversation. I don't know how many people read The Conversation outlet, which would be more accessible to a popular audience. And this piece is important because they show in their work that climate action is stalling, not that action is lacking. Because they actually review over 24 climate change initiatives from the city level to the national level to the regional level, global level, etc., which are really powerful initiatives. However, once the momentum is garnered, in fact there's a lot of popular support for these initiatives, it stalls. And moving forward becomes a big problem. So my final proposition is that we need a fully transformative approach, and to do so we need a truly interdisciplinary take on the issue. And an interdisciplinary sort of a Renaissance approach as well, if you will. In other words, it's not just an environmental or economic or social or political or even technological issue, it's all of the above. In the context of the specific question we're trying to address, in this session, for instance, and as a political scientist, I could not come up with an answer that's truly meaningful and impactful without a better understanding of what my propositions might imply from an economic standpoint, sociological standpoint, technological, and especially from the actual science behind these propositions. So for now, I want to humbly acknowledge that these propositions are focused on the socio-political implications of the renewables versus non-renewables dynamics, and they need a more integral and interdisciplinary conversation with other disciplines to be able to fully address this question. I'm not saying that we should all try to become Renaissance people, but rather that we should engage with different disciplines more seriously in a more collaborative manner. But we do have scholars, I thought I would point out one of them, who have shown very exciting interdisciplinary work. And I think this can be inspiring for junior scholars who are looking for new types of approaching global issues. And the example that I have here is environmental historian Alfred Crosby, who has done some extraordinary, I think in my opinion at least, some extraordinary work and important interdisciplinary work, who we may call some type of Renaissance scholar. He recently died, 2018, so not that long ago. He's actually someone from Boston, so also not too far from here. But he fused the disciplines of history, sociology, and many STEM work in his scholarship. And this book that I have here is called The Children of the Sun, A History of Humanity's Unappeasable Appetite for Energy. It was published in 2006. There's a lot of reprints of this book for those who are interested in such an interdisciplinary approach. There are, of course, many debates about the book. I'm not saying that it's perfect, but I think it's a good trigger for how one may approach things from a truly interdisciplinary perspective, because I am sure you've all heard the call for interdisciplinary approaches. There are a lot of departments that are now fundamentally interdisciplinary, but when it comes to the actual implementation of carrying interdisciplinary work, that becomes an issue. But I do want to also stress that important interdisciplinary work is already being done, not just from an individual perspective. Because if you take the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and their 2018 special report, for instance, it involved 3 groups that were in constant collaboration to come up with this report. Working Group 1, for instance, assessed the physical science basis behind climate change. Working Group number 2 addressed impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, and Working Group 3 dealt with the mitigation of climate change. So a lot of people from the STEM world and social sciences and humanities, lawyers, etc., involved in coming up with this report. So in my remarks today, my aim was to just highlight the need to move beyond a mere coexistence that looks more like a compromise towards a more radical change that challenges the status quo. And yet, when thinking of the possibility of a fossil fuel-free world in the quest towards a decarbonized world, the responses that we often hear are impossible, or for the most optimistic of us, unlikely. We just don't see how decarbonization can happen because our entire world is so deeply fossil fuel driven. I mean, right now in this room, there's so many activities and so many things that are being able to occur because we are using fossil fuel energy. So in that sense, calling for decarbonization may seem like it's a call for degrowth, since fossil fuels are what makes most things move forward, literally and figuratively. And this would indeed be fitting, since the degrowth movement is an ecological movement concerned with the fact that consumerism facilitated by continuous economic growth is leading us to environmental catastrophe. And as such, it advocates for a complete switch away from economic growth. That is not what I'm advocating for. I just wanted to point out the fact that a lot of these discussions that can be very radical, they are not productive if they are too extreme at the same time. I don't think promoting decarbonization is to advocate a complete abandonment of economic growth. It's rather a call for a different path towards growth. So I want to end by stressing that the message I'm highlighting in my remarks today about a global interdisciplinary approach to decarbonization is very much already underway and being taken seriously in many different contexts. It seems radical. For me, even it is radical. But it is happening. I mean, if you take a powerful industrialized country like Germany already having a binding agreement against all odds to try and make it happen, it's not clear if others will follow suit or if they will follow suit anytime soon, but the conversation is happening, and it's happening at a very serious level. So I look forward to engaging with you all in the Q&A and with my fellow panelists on this.
Thank Thank you very much for that, Nadege. And now we move over to Dr. Todd Moss.
Okay.
So feel free to come here or again.
Yeah, I don't have slides, so I'll stay here if that's okay. And can everybody hear me okay if I leave that there? Is that okay for the video? Okay. So, thanks, Nadege. A lot of what she said I agree with. We absolutely need to decarbonize the global economy, and we absolutely need a global approach. Those two things are inescapable, But I have a slightly different perspective when you think about what a global approach actually implies. So let's start with a couple of facts. One is that energy is essential to everything about the way we live and everything about not just lifestyles, but the economy that we live in, the economy that we prosper in. And it's not too much to say that human prosperity is, the foundation of human prosperity is energy, and a lot of energy. It's also, I've never heard of that book, but energy is not unappeasable. Okay, if you look at energy trends, very poor people use very little energy. Then as people and countries start to become wealthier, their energy starts to accelerate, but it's an S curve. And then you hit a certain level and your energy starts to plateau. And in fact, we're now starting to see energy come down, including in the United States. Per capita energy consumption is actually just starting to come down, and it's not having a negative effect on income. So we're starting to see a little bit of the decoupling, which is that we're getting more efficient at using energy to make ourselves wealthier, healthier, and live better lives. We're just getting better at it. It shouldn't be surprising. We would hope that technology would help us do that. But it's absolutely essential to human society, human civilization, and human well-being. The second big fact that matters is that we have absolutely massive global inequalities. So when we talk about decarbonization, we talk about reducing our energy consumption, we need to distinguish between people who are living in energy abundant societies, like all of us, and people who are living in energy poverty, or where energy is a constraint on their living standards, on their ability to earn income, on their ability to live a healthy, long life. I'll come back to a little bit of that in a second. And then I've worked my entire career on sub-Saharan Africa. Started in Zimbabwe, so super pleased to be here, Shingi. And I think Africa is the region that is the most energy poor of the world. And it's also, when we start to think about the relationship between energy, climate change, emissions, Africa is the region that is the least responsible for climate change. And that needs to be our starting point for when we start thinking about the energy technologies that we want people to use and deploy, say, in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And it's not just that, well, Europe and the United States polluted a lot in the past, and now everybody else is catching up. It's true that China and India are starting to catch up. But today, the average American emits 33 times as much CO2 as the average Nigerian. Okay, so we're already moving. So any American or anybody living in the United States who thinks they have a good idea for what Nigeria should do on energy, their starting point is, I am already emitting 33 times as much as a Nigerian before I start telling them what they should do. And as you can tell, there's a ton of hypocrisy in this field. And I work in the energy and development policy arena in Washington, D.C., and I deal with this rank hypocrisy every single day. I'll give you a couple of statistics. So the single most important financier of infrastructure in Africa is the World Bank. Okay? The World Bank is based in downtown Washington, D.C. Now, the World Bank will not finance a coal project. The World Bank will not finance upstream gas or oil. The World Bank will not finance nuclear power. They will not. It's very hard to finance a downstream gas project or even large hydro. It's very hard in the World Bank. They put up a lot of barriers. Okay? The World Bank gets its power at the headquarters from a company called PEPCO in Washington, D.C. PEPCO's power generation, for all those people setting those policies inside the World Bank, PEPCO's power is 95% coal, gas, and nuclear. 95%. And if you've been to Washington, D.C. in the summer, it is hot and disgusting, and every office building, including the World Bank, is cranking air conditioning, and that's all being run on nuclear, coal, and gas. Okay? Here's another statistic for you. So the electricity sector, which is only a small subset of the global energy sector, but the electricity sector, very important, because the electricity sector is responsible for, I think, around 40% of global emissions, and that's because of coal and gas production, mostly. The electricity sector also has massive inequalities, okay? The state of California, just California, Californians playing online video games, okay, consume more power playing video games than the entire country of Ghana, okay? Hot tubs and swimming pools, just hot tubs and swimming pools in the state of California consume more electricity than the entire country of Senegal, okay? So again, we've got a place where people have hot tubs, people want to play online video games, and they're consuming a ton of electricity, but they don't realize it because it's invisible. It's out there, it's produced somewhere else. Even the video games, you know, the energy is going through a server. Yet there are entire countries that don't have the same amount of electricity as Californian video gamers. There's another one that I just saw that drives me absolutely crazy. So as climate change gets worse and temperatures get hot, what do we all need? We all need air conditioning, okay? Well, most countries, almost nobody can afford air conditioning. It's an absolute luxury. Only the richest people in many parts of Africa can afford air conditioning, okay? In New York City, there's now a company that holds yoga classes inside a cold storage facility. So we can use industrial air conditioning for yoga in New York, but many countries don't have regular air conditioning for people to sleep, to work, to refrigerate food. So these gaps need to be in our minds as we start thinking about what kinds of energy systems are we actually trying to build in the future. So that's kind of a starting point. Another, I think, very important question is that fossil fuels are not monolithic. They're called fossil fuels. They're all carbon-based, but they're actually quite different, okay? Some of them are relatively easy to get rid of. Some of them are very hard to get rid of, okay? Getting oil and fuel out of cars, small cars, not that hard. We can electrify if we have the electricity capacity, additional electricity capacity. We can electrify cars. Trucks, ships, planes, very difficult. Very, very difficult to get fossil fuels out of there. Coal, again, coal is the worst emitter, and the coal industry is in steep decline. And basically, outside of a few Asian countries, coal is in a very steep decline. In Africa, coal is essentially dead. South Africa is the only coal country of any global significance, and they're in massive trouble. And their coal industry. So I would go out on a limb and say, in the next 30 years, maybe we'll see maybe 2 coal plants built in Africa, maybe 3. Probably not, definitely not 10, I would bet. I'll take a bet on that, not 10, okay? Germany just opened, Germany, our best example of a decarbonizing economy, just opened a brand new huge coal plant this month. Why? Because they turned their nuclear power plants off and they need all this baseload power. So Germany is actually, in some ways, a good goal setter and doing really stupid things in other ways. Now gas is the really interesting one. Now gas is interesting because gas is essential to the energy transition in the US. Coal is mostly being replaced by gas. And gas is incredibly useful as a fossil fuel. So if anybody here is a cook, every cook prefers to cook in gas. If you want, great for heating water. And so in large parts of Asia, this is already happening. In Africa, it's not happening yet. Most people cook with biomass, cooking with wood, which is even worse than coal, okay? And it's terrible for deforestation in a million reasons. But if you can transition people from wood to LPG to gas canisters, that's hugely beneficial for development. It's beneficial for local air pollution, especially for women who cook indoors with wood. It's terrible for all kinds of health things. And it's also really good for global emissions because you're moving from wood to gas. So LPG is actually a great fossil fuel. And then there's natural gas, or LNG, liquefied natural gas, that is part of the industrial power system. So a lot of American power comes from burning natural gas. The US happens to have a ton of natural gas, and we even now export it. They freeze it. If you've ever seen a ship and it looks like it's got these huge balls on them, that's an LNG gas tanker that's exporting natural gas. Now, natural gas is actually really interesting in Africa because Africa needs to build a lot more electricity capacity, and Africa has a ton of gas, and it's already being developed. The question is all of Africa's gas going to be exported to Asia and maybe parts of Europe, or will any of it get used at home in Africa for development? That's an important question. So let me talk a little bit about renewables. Renewables are super exciting. I'm a massive fan of solar and wind. They're incredible, and they're getting cheaper and better literally every year. They also have some pretty severe limits. It's very hard. It's essentially impossible to build an economy on an unreliable source of electricity. Any business, if they want to be competitive, they have to have power 24/7, and it has to be cheap. Those two things have to happen. And in every market, every country is different, and actually regions of countries are different. They're going to have different resources available to them, and they need to find the ideal mix of renewables, baseload. Some are cheap, some are expensive, and they're going to have that mix. But what every economy needs is reliable, low-cost power. How they get that is going to differ. Now, the best source depends what you care about. But the source with the least downside that we heard about earlier is geothermal. You're basically drilling for underground steam. It's a great source, has zero carbon. If you do it smartly, it can be renewable, it can carry on, and it goes all the time. It's very reliable. The problem is you have to live somewhere where you're either over a volcano or some kind of geological formation that allows you to have it. So if you're lucky, like Kenya's getting half their power from geothermal, super lucky. Exploit that all you can. If you're lucky to have a big river that you can dam and use that, that's great too. Because hydro, it's very reliable. It's super, super cheap, right? So there are still dams that were built 50 years ago that are producing 2-cent power, right? 2-cent power is very cheap. But not everybody has that. Some places have a different mix. And as in New England, I don't know very much about the New England power market, okay? But it's not a very sunny place, especially in the winter. So solar is just not going to be very useful here. You're going to pay for solar. It's going to give you just a little bit out the other end. If you live in Morocco, very sunny often. Morocco is a great place for a lot of solar power. Morocco, maybe they could go to 30 or 40 or 50% solar. I don't know. They can go to very high solar proportion. But every economy will still need the other base load. And why gas is so positive is that gas does many things to complement wind and solar. So gas has there's something called a peaker plant, natural gas plant, that you can flip on and off very quickly. So if you've got solar or wind plant, you pair it with gas plant, you crank the cheap solar and wind when the wind's blowing and it's sunny, and when it's not, you crank up the gas, and the customer doesn't even know, right? So that's how you can balance that out. Gas is also really great for industry. So a lot of big factories that need industrial heat, that gas is also really good at that. Solar is terrible at industrial heat, right? So you're going to turn the sun, think of how inefficient this is. You're going to turn the sun, it's going to go into a panel, that's going to turn into electricity. You're going to go down all these wires, and then you're going to use that electricity to then reheat an element to generate heat again. It's terribly inefficient. So solar is horrible at generating heat, which is why solar is great at lighting, low voltage technology, which is why if you have a solar panel, you can run your lights all day long. At night you need batteries, but you're going to have a really hard time heating water. You're going to have you can't run an air conditioner or a dryer or anything like that, right? So again, it's trying to get that mix so that you get all the energy services that you need. Am I out of time? Yeah, okay. And then one thing that I see in Africa, I think I'll flag, and then I want to come back to the climate change issue to finish on that, is that I work on what I call energy poverty, which are people that live without enough energy. And if I say, do you have any ideas of a solution to energy poverty? What would you think about? Anything come to mind? Maybe like a solar home system, like a little solar panel that people can put on their roofs, and they can run lights and charge their cell phones. It's exploding all over Africa. You're seeing this in lots of places. It's terrific technology, okay? But household electricity is only 5% of global energy consumption. 5%. And even within electricity at home, you can only do a few things with these little systems. So solar home systems are kind of like a nice first step for energy for people that have nothing, that live very remotely. Having a nice little solar home system for lights, and maybe you can do a small TV or a fan, that's great. But if you want to have if you want to have a larger consumption at home, maybe one day you want an air conditioner, or you want a computer, or you want to have a job that has power to run a grinding mill or data servers, you're going to need much, much bigger energy. All right, so let me just end on the climate problem, and hopefully we can think about the climate problem in a way that's often conflated, which is conflating the mitigation of climate with adaptation to climate change, okay? So mitigation the problem is we're emitting too many greenhouse gases. So the answer in the West is we have to stop doing that. We have to decarbonize our economy, and where we can, we have to reduce our energy consumption. This is the electrify everything, promote energy efficiency, move from incandescent lights to LEDs, all of that stuff. Move from gas cars to electric cars. Now, that's absolutely the agenda in the West. The problem is that we're also suggesting that our strategy of mitigation is also what poor countries should do. So Africa should also mitigate carbon emissions by decarbonizing their power and reducing their energy consumption. But that can't possibly work because these places are not consuming enough energy to make any difference. So let me give you one statistic on this. Okay, last year, the global electricity consumption of everyone on the planet, it grew by 900 terawatt hours. Okay, 900 terawatt hours, total global electricity consumption. Total African electricity consumption in all of Africa was only 500 terawatt hours, about half. So if we got Africa to emit zero and to consume zero energy, zero, and imagine the awful welfare effects that would have for 1 billion people, but they consume zero. The rest of the world would add that much more electricity to the global market in 6 months. Right? So again, there is no mitigation play in poor countries. Okay? Now, what about adaptation? Now, we actually, Nadege was right. We're actually, it's urgent, but we're terrible at it. We're failing miserably. Okay? We are not, the US in particular, is not reducing our emissions nearly fast enough. But lucky for us, we have a backup plan. We can adapt. We have wealth, and we have infrastructure. So when a storm hits, we can rebuild. When it gets too hot in Boston, what do? We turn up the air conditioning, right? But in Africa, they don't have the same wealth and infrastructure to do that. Okay, so if we think about the effects of climate change, and I'll just pick 3, okay? Extreme weather, what do you need to deal with extreme weather events? You need resilient infrastructure. Infrastructure is mostly cement and steel, okay? That's what it is, plus engineering. Cement and steel. To deal with drought, you need pumped irrigation, and for places running out of water, you have to desalinate. You can build desalination plants, turn ocean water into fresh water. And for rising temperatures, you need air conditioning and cold storage. Okay, now, cement, steel, desalination, air conditioning, these are among the most energy-intensive technologies out there. So the adaptation agenda in a place like sub-Saharan Africa is not less energy, it's orders of magnitude more energy. And this is, in a way, the opposite of energy austerity. So again, we really need, when we think about the future of our global energy system and how that interacts with climate change and our emissions plans, we really need to separate out the countries that are causing the problem, the countries that have the resources to respond to the problem, and be sure that we're not imposing bad solutions on poor people and essentially pulling up the ladder on development for billions of people. By our estimate, at least 3 billion people, basically half of humanity, lives in a place where energy is either too expensive, unavailable, or too unreliable to live with a modern lifestyle and in a modern economy that many of us take for granted. So I'll stop there.
So now we'll get right into the Q&A. I'm sure you're ready to engage in the complex dynamics of this topic. So, yeah.
Is there anything that individuals living in energy-rich societies can do to reduce it, or is the individual impact not big enough to change it?
So there's a lot of virtue signaling, right, that goes on. Look, I think that everyone should aspire to live a lifestyle that's consistent with their own values and morals. So yes, you should try to adapt your lifestyle to what you believe. You should try to do that with as little hypocrisy as possible. I know, I'm not going to call this person out, but they're a very prominent climate academic and advocate here in the greater Boston area, who has flown business class to China 60 times in her career, okay? And it's like, there's a real value. I think that she should do that because she's helping to negotiate emissions reductions in China. So I'm glad she's not saying I'm not going to fly to China. But you also have to recognize some of the hypocrisy and not take for granted some of the energy that is embedded in the way that you live. But for systemic change, there's actually a really wonderful book by a guy named Gernot Wagner, who's at Harvard now. And he's one of these guys, he's a young academic, super lives like a vegan, super low carbon lifestyle, but he wrote this book about why everything he does doesn't matter. And what matters essentially are the market signals out in the wider economy. So we may all decide that we're willing to pay, we're going to be educated and have good jobs and globally aware. We're going to pay $5,000 extra to have an electric vehicle because we want to do our part to reduce emissions. But when electric vehicles will really take off when they are cheaper and better than internal combustion engines. That might happen, that will happen in your lifetimes. Probably happen in my lifetime. But until that happens, you're not going to see that magic switch. And that's why like solar is a wonderful technology. The reason we all aren't running on solar is that it's not better than the alternatives. It's cheaper in increments. It's cheaper when it's really sunny, but it doesn't serve all of the energy needs that we have. When storage gets really cheap and solar technology gets cheaper, maybe that will happen, but you need those market signals to really shift for everyone to react that way. But I'm an economist, so of course I would say that.
I have two questions. They're just almost factual. Neither of you said too much about nuclear energy, and I wonder what you think about, that as part of the mix, because I know some notable groups have changed their position on nuclear energy. And is it helpful for institutions to divest from fossil fuels? Does that help send a market signal, or is that just virtue signaling? Or is there another alternative in there that I'm not thinking of?
Thank you. I guess I can take those questions as well. Thanks for your questions. I think on the nuclear side, from what I see is there's a lot of negative thoughts associated with it because of the fear of radioactivity, right? Even though if you look at historically, there hasn't been that many actual nuclear disasters. I don't know how many people have seen Chernobyl in this room, but if you think at it factually, there actually hasn't been that many disasters, but just the fear of how to deal with the potential radioactive place is what's stopping people. That's my simple answer, but I don't have the scientific expertise to expand on it further. In terms of divestment, I would say that I actually think it relates to the earlier question about what smaller actions can do, even though I think that it's probably bigger than individual actions. I think it's part of really moving away from the culturally accepted convenience of, again, and I acknowledge the hypocrisy, right? I think from everything, from the way we dress, consuming fashion, watching TV, etc., we are really part of this way of life. But I think until we find a way to get out of it, at the very micro level, and at the university level, it's not that micro, I don't think. It's going to be hard to have a more systematic change. So I'm definitely pro divestment. I know at U of T we're having a lot of discussions around that. And a lot of the environmental governance lab people are actually pushing forward. I don't know how or when that will happen. And even, again, going back to the hypocrisy factor, the Monk School of Global Affairs is, after, Monk, who is like a big extractive industries person, right? And part of the funding we're getting in the environmental governance lab comes from him. So it's a very complicated thing to approach, but I don't think it's enough for us to give up on how little effect, on the importance of how something so little can eventually become so big. So it's a roundabout way to say that yes to divestment. And nuclear, I think it's just people are really afraid of the radioactivity.
So nuclear is really interesting, and if you care about climate, you should be fighting to keep all nuclear power plants open. I mean, for the climate, it's actually the best it's actually a zero carbon. Even hydro is not zero. Even wind and solar are not zero because there's emissions embedded in a lot of the materials, right? So, but people are just, it's a very emotional thing. And Fukushima was a terrible incident, and people saw those pictures of that mass destruction, which was actually from the tsunami, not from the nuclear accident, but they conflated those. I do actually think that there's a new generation of nuclear engineers. There's actually a lot of younger people at places like Carnegie Mellon and MIT that are helping to build a next generation nuclear industry. So I think it's coming back, and it's dealing with a lot of the issues that make nuclear difficult. Some of the safety issues are being built into new designs. But I do think that it is coming back. If you really care about nuclear, if you really care about the climate, nuclear needs to be part of the mix, and probably massively ramped up as fast as you can. Some of the micronuclear models are actually really interesting. So, I mean, we don't think about it this way, but there are tons of U.S. naval ships going around the world. They all work on nuclear reactors, right? It's just we have these accidents of Chernobyl and Fukushima and 3 Mile Island in our heads, and it scares people. And Germany's decision is absolutely terrible because they are literally one-for-one replacing nuclear power with coal. So there's a great paper that just came out about a month ago that quantified the number of deaths that will happen from German coal, from new German coal, from taking down their nuclear plants. And it was, I don't want to say the exact number, but it was like 10,000 people will die because of this German decision, because of the extra emissions. On fossil fuels divestment, I'm a little bit torn, to be frank. I think the signaling can be an important statement for an activist community. I think divestment from apartheid South Africa didn't really squeeze the South Africans, didn't have any practical effect, but it was an important kind of signal about what kind of world that people wanted. And if you want a fossil-free world, maybe you shouldn't invest in a fossil fuel company. I can see that. But in a practical sense, your divestment's not going to effectively raise the cost of capital for some of the largest companies in the world. And really, if we want a cleaner future energy system, the companies that are going to be at the leading edge of that are going to be BP, Exxon, Engie. I mean, these big energy companies are actually the ones that are going to be doing a lot of the technology, the R&D, and the implementation of the clean energy transition. So, you know, companies, this is like the third time I said this today, are not monolithic, right? So there are companies that are good and that are really trying to, you know, move the needle, and people within those companies trying to get them to adapt. And then there are other companies that are, you know, stuck in the past and hanging on for dear life. So, you know, I would think an aware investor would want to encourage the progressive companies, even though many of them will be fossil fuel funded now, and avoid some of the ones that they think are not doing the right thing. So, I think, you know, feed-in tariffs work if the grid can handle it, and a lot of markets don't have a grid that can handle it, basically. So, look, this is going to be the standard economist answer to this is that you need a carbon tax. You essentially just need a way for capturing the externality of the emissions. And once it's in the price, everyone will adapt to the price, and you'll see all the innovation and the reduction and all of that behavior that you want will happen. The problem is that people have known about a carbon tax and been talking about a carbon tax for 40 years, and the political alignment for it is just really difficult. And as somebody who's like at the interface between academia and policymaking, the cleverest model in the world is useless if it's not presented or baked in a way that it can actually happen in the real world. And those political alignments matter a lot. And so there are literally thousands of people working on climate models and carbon tax models. But the hard piece is not getting the ideal exactly right, but figuring out what kind of political coalition with what messaging and what formula could you actually get it done, particularly in a place like the United States where you have a very complicated set of actors. But China too. Why would China, I know nothing about Chinese policymaking, but Chinese policymakers are going to be perfectly rational in the face of the incentives they face. What would be the way that you could get them to move? So.
I mean, I'm not an economist, I'm a political science, so I would add the discussion on the partisan politics are very important. If you take Canada, for instance, the Ontario government, previous government, which was Liberal, had all these incentives for electric vehicles, including, a lot of financial incentives for drivers who choose to have electric vehicles, parking lots, etc. And as soon as the current Conservative government came on board, they actually went and removed a lot of these parking lots that were meant for electric vehicles. So I think this happens a lot, going to your point about the political dynamics. And despite genuine solutions that people bring forward, until and unless there is if possible, a non-partisan way of actually approaching the climate change, it's going to be hard to actually have sustainable. So to have a sustainable way forward, because if you think about these electric vehicles, even though it's so specific to Canada, I'm sure if not even just to Canada, but to the province of Ontario in Canada, I'm sure if we look at a lot of different examples across the world, changes in political regimes are bringing things that some people have spent years building only to be torn apart overnight. But I wonder if I can sort of steal that discussion about how something works in one place and not really working in another, to tie back to some of the discussions that you brought in your remarks, specifically the idea of energy poor countries versus energy rich countries. I completely agree with a lot of what you said about the hypocrisy of it all, right? And that we cannot be telling others how to behave. But I'm wondering if the assumption that this linear economic development, sort of like this linear growth, must be pursued by African countries, isn't also problematic in terms of it's about the catch-up phase, right? Because as you mentioned, there's a lot of the climate, the energy poor places, especially in Africa, are the ones that are actually suffering the most from climate change, even though their input to climate change is really negligible. But nonetheless, they are suffering from those consequences. So it is difficult to say that they should still be pursuing the same development model that has led us to this sort of impasse that we have. Because if you notice, we both approached the question, but I don't think we have suggested something clear about how to get out of this contradiction, right? Where we acknowledge that, fossil fuels are giving us this powerful and efficient energy that we all rely on, especially if you're thinking from a development perspective, but that it's not sustainable and that we need to find a way out. So isn't it problematic then to suggest, and I don't know if that's what you're suggesting, that African countries should keep doing what they're doing because they're not contributing as much. Because I agree with the general observations, but the implications of what we should do, I'm not so sure. Sorry, I just thought I wanted to bring that up. Thanks for the question.
Fine. I actually think it's interesting you brought up that point about Africa because, and I'm actually curious to know because you both, in Shingi's introduction, you both have done some work in African countries. So I'm interested in the work you have done in these countries, including Ghana, because I'm from Ghana. Because if I look at the news, for example, climate change is hardly a featured topic as something important that we need to be really tackling as African countries and as we develop because we're developing. So yeah, I'm curious to know what research you've done and what the outcomes are.
Oh, okay. I think that's a great question because I want to actually bring a point of my field research. So first, my field research for my PhD actually didn't deal with the environment, which I'm addressing now in my book manuscript, but it was looking at the resource development nexus. Countries rich in resources, specifically oil exploitation, and how that leads to or not, in the case of many African countries, to development. But during the field research, I was exposed to a lot of environmental discussions. So in South Africa, for instance, in the Karoo region, and this was in 2013, so sort of a desertic area where there was natural gas extraction, exploration actually specifically happening, and they were using fracking. And that actually was an interesting, it sort of made me think about your point about, energy poor, energy rich. It's a class and race thing that was happening, obviously, unsurprisingly, in South Africa. But I would focus on the fact that a lot of the people who were already well off in the Karoo region, because I was going around interviewing community members who were very close to the areas that were being affected. A lot of people who were already rich wanted the place to remain pristine. They were really into the environmental part of things. People who were very, very poor saw this as an opportunity for work, to get out of poverty, to have food for their families, etc., etc. And I think at a global level, and maybe regional level, that is probably what is happening on the continent, right? People are at a point where it's almost a luxury to be thinking about the environment, because on a daily basis, you're trying to feed yourself, you're trying to get out of the place where you are. And I think because of that, perhaps there hasn't been that much distraction. But we should also be aware that there are extreme weather events happening all across the continent. And sadly, often it's not being reported as such on the continent. You would actually find these discussions from like Western media outlet, but not as much within the places where it's happening. But I think it's, in an interesting way, it probably relates to the discussions of energy poverty and energy wealth.
Yeah, I think the Karoo fracking example is a good little microcosm of the sort of bigger issue, which is if you already feel like you have all the energy you need, you might prioritize something else, right? But if you feel like you're poor, you don't have opportunity, and that energy could help to provide that, you might prioritize that and live with dirtier air. Or, climate change is almost one of the reasons it's such a difficult topic to tackle, is because it's it's very indirect, right? So even an individual storm, is it climate change? Is it not? Is it just that the risk of a bad storm is from climate change? It's very hard to say with precision, like that happened only, and so that makes it, it's a kind of theoretical in the future issue for most people, and people live day to day. And if your children are starving and you can't find a job, And then you actually don't care about 2 degrees in 2050. You care about tomorrow. And that's not a thing that's unique to any particular region. That's true everywhere. I was on a panel, House Energy Committee, and this rural electricity cooperative did not want to turn off their coal plants because it was going to raise the price for their poor rural customers in Arkansas, and they weren't going to do that. And it's not that they didn't know that coal was causing all of these problems, especially for poor people in Arkansas, but they did not want to raise their electricity bills. That trade-off, the rubber hits the road with that trade-off often. I'll just add, since you're from Ghana, I spent a lot of time in Ghana. I did actually my PhD work in Ghana, not on energy, on finance, but Ghana is such an important country because it does everything before everyone else in Africa. So what they do matters across the region. So first to be independent, first to go through IMF structural adjustment reforms, one of the first to go from a military to a multi-party democracy transition. And so people are also looking to Ghana now on energy. And Ghana has a really interesting energy history because the main source of electricity in Ghana is a big dam that was actually signed by Kwame Nkrumah and John F. Kennedy more than 50 years ago. Actually, 70 years ago. 70 years ago. Is that right? No, 60 years ago. And then they found oil in 2007. So they've also got gas. And it's Ghana, West Africa, a lot of solar potential. So Ghana is trying to figure out how to get that mix together, and they're making a lot of mistakes, but they're doing a lot of things right. And that is definitely going to be a place to watch.
Can I just add a quick thing on Ghana as well? In terms of doing things differently, or maybe the first. Because of the oil find in 2007, which is why I was there for my field work, I was investigating African states' dynamics with the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is this global governance initiative that is seeking to regulate the governance of revenues from mining and oil. Ghana actually did what I think is an extraordinary thing by insisting that the definition of extractive go beyond mining, oil, and gas. And they succeeded. So in the EITI, Ghana's extractive industries actually include forestry and fisheries, which actually comes from a very grassroots-led movement because they're saying these definitions are from the West. They care about mining and oil more than everything else. But actually our communities are dependent more directly on the forestry and the fisheries and how that is impacted by the recent oil extraction. So the fact that they were successful is really important. And for me, even though the discussions of the environmental aspect tends to come second, or not at all in many places after the development aspect, economic development aspect. This was a genuine concern for the environment, like a direct concern of what oil extractions and eventually the existing mineral extraction would do to the forestries and the fisheries. So I thought I'd mention that after your point on Ghana. Thanks.
Oh yes, thank you both for very enlightening expositions on these very complex subjects, and actually that is the focus of my question. I mean, I hear the global discussion and I hear this very particular, contextual approach to some of these issues, or this bigger issue, and I think that rightly, they both approaches somehow, complement each other, depending on what, where, and how. The problem I think that somehow reflects the whole discussion is, and you have touched on it a little bit, but maybe a little bit more on how these discussions reflect, or reach society. Because I think that, I mean, like the hypocrisy of behavior, of various institutions and companies, I think that, a lot of these discussions also are, to a significant extent, very removed from society, very intellectual. Even you look at the interface between policy and academia, there is a disconnect sometimes, but even further, that when you try to translate that into society, sometimes the gap widens. And I think that it's making us not really capture the essence of these discussions. So, I mean, especially from Todd, I mean, you have been in several spheres, academia, the practical world, policy circles. I mean, how do you see these discussions reaching, common people in society, and maybe how long ago from now? Maybe there is a movement toward that, but it appears that still is a very, it's kind of challenging, and I think that even in academic circles, some of these discussions sometimes still challenge us. We might be discussing these as academics or in intellectual circles, but not everyone really is on board with the discussion, getting to the root of it. The terminology, is dense, it's complex, it's very technical a lot of the time. So how do you bring that down to the very, common societal level for people to grasp this? And I wanted also that you clarify a little bit. I'm not very clear with the term energy poverty. Does it have to do with availability or access or use, or how is that? So
I'm gonna go with the discussion on how to basically bring environmental awareness to more popular field, trying to make it simple, your comment.
Yes.
I actually think right now it is happening, right? And it's happening at the grassroots level, a very activist-driven level. People haven't waited for academics. They might have been informed by scientists and academics and policymakers, but they didn't wait for those people, us, to come and say, hey, here's what you should do. Let's bring it to this level. I always hesitate mentioning, Greta Thunberg, but I think she has definitely become like this big trigger of activist work with the Fridays for Future movement, but so many other youth around the world that have been pushing for this. But especially in my experience in Canada, over the last decade, indigenous grassroots movements have been really, really big player in activist movement about the effect of extractive industries, for instance, on the environment. So I think we are at a crisis level, at a point where society is actually taking things on their own hands, and I think you can actually see the sort of feedback effect back onto academics and policymakers. If you take the activists, for instance, if you take Greta Thunberg and check how many leaders around the world have been lining up to speak with her, right? It tells you how important individual activists, individual groups have become, especially youth around the world. So I think, I don't know whether that answers your question, but I'm saying that the crisis itself has been taken up by grassroots movements that are feeling frustrated by what they perceive as inaction from academics and from policymakers, which I think is right, because I think for too long it remained at this high level and we were just speaking among ourselves. But now we're actually forced to engage with activists, which is extremely important because after all, it is impacting society. If you look at current work right now amongst global environmental politics scholars, there is not just the fact that they're engaging with these recent movements, but they're actually themselves becoming activists, right? I mean, academic Twitter is quite interesting place to observe environmental politics scholars specifically, which I think when I was maybe starting my master's, people weren't so vocal about their ideologies publicly and were not as involved in bringing their ideologies forward when discussing objective things in academia. But right now it is being normalized on the other side. So that's what I would say about that. And I'm guessing your second question is more for Todd.
Yeah, for the most part. Yeah, but
So I don't think most people care at all what academics think, and they're not waiting for insights to come down from the tower. And most academics probably realize that, and they don't care either. There's a lot of self-separation, right? If you look at, so I'm a recovering academic. I was at LSE, but you know, the academic profession, particularly the tenure process, for those of you thinking about becoming academics, the tenure process is driven largely on your ability to get into a very narrow set of academic journals, which are not just unintelligible to the general public, but deliberately so. And I have many friends on the tenure hamster wheel right now, and when they're asked to do something that would be publicly engaging, they're actually discouraged because it can harm their tenure chances. You're trying to write for the New York Times. You should be writing for American Political Science Review, right? That's how you get tenure. So, and if you're blogging, one of the best academics, he's actually Canadian, although he teaches at the University of Chicago, one of the best academics in the world on conflict, Chris Blattman, is really well known through his blogging and social media. And he got moved from great university, and I kept telling him, stop. Actually, I don't want this on video. If you can cut this part. Stop with the blogging. You should be working on academic papers, right? You got to work on your journal. So there's this deliberate kind of spacing, and where I do think the academic, and particularly the science community, can play an important role is in helping to fill out the details, right? So nobody's looking for professor of environmental studies to motivate me to care about climate change or wildlife protection or whatever it is. I'll get that from celebrities, my parents, my friends. Where do you get all of your other ideas? Your favorite sports star who's all of a sudden talking about some issue, or Greta Thunberg. But where the science community can help is, okay, there's now some political motivation to save leopards or promote electric vehicles or whatever it is. That's where science can come in and say, okay, here's how we can do this in a more efficient manner. So I think everybody has their role. There are some academics who see themselves as public intellectuals and want to be activists, but the vast majority, not at all. Energy poverty, so there is no real definition of energy poverty. It's just a state of where energy is a constraint on your living, on your life, and your opportunity. And this is what one thing I find really interesting is, so do people, I'm always interested if people actually care about this. People know about the Sustainable Development Goals, UN SDGs, like everybody knows about that? Okay, I don't know, that's like a Washington DC UN thing. So Sustainable Development Goal 7, number 7 is on energy poverty. And it is, the Sustainable Development Goal 7 is to provide access to modern, affordable, sustainable energy for everyone by 2030. That is a wonderful goal. Everyone should have that. The metric for measuring that, let's wipe out energy poverty. The metric for measuring that is what's called access to electricity at home. And there's a percentage for every country. Nigeria is at 40%, like 120 countries are at 100%, so that goal doesn't matter for them. We want to get everybody to 100%. But the way that it's defined to have modern access at home is essentially a light bulb. That you have a light bulb that runs on either a solar panel or a solar lantern or some electricity connection. And many people who actually have an electricity connection, they have a plug, they're connected by a wire, the power's out all the time, right? It can go out for 4 months, it goes out. The average firm in Nigeria has a power outage more than once a day. So, so the metric for success is so low, and that's the percentage of people with energy access, that energy access, the way we've defined it, does not solve energy poverty. So energy poverty, for me, is where you actually wouldn't even think about it. Energy is just there when you need it. You can get gasoline when you need it. If you were starting a business, if you were going to do a startup, you were going to have a tech startup with your idea, would the first thing you'd be thinking about, okay, we have to buy a generator, we have to get a diesel person, what's our electricity cost going to be? I would bet not one person in this room knows what they pay for electricity per kilowatt hour at home. And that's because it's cheap, it's always there, it's 24/7, and we don't even think about it. That's the end of energy poverty, where you don't even think about it. Energy is just there when you need it.
So I have a quick question, because you just talked about activism from grassroots level all the way to academics. And in many ways, activists or critics of the fossil fuel industry rarely come into contact with energy companies. You mentioned that the substantive change in terms of efficiency or even a shift to renewables is going to come from the biggest energy companies. To what extent are these companies actually involved in conversations about, making improvements in terms of efficiency or renewable energies? Are they just being regarded as the boogeyman, as the cause of all these problems, or are there any efforts or even platforms for engaging in a productive way, which might be different from the activism, that primarily driven by virtue signaling? Are they involved? Are they willing to be involved? Are there ways of bringing these two worlds together to, there was a discussion about that part is the nature of the issue. There's an existential issue. Are there any efforts in that regard? That's for you both.
Yeah, I can start. I was just thinking about the Conference of the Parties. What was it? It was in Madrid. There was this clash. I don't know if people were watching this, with the activists literally being removed because they were protesting, right? I think often the sensational ways in which activists and policymakers, companies, etc., come into contact is usually the activists organizing the alternative conference and then clashing. But I think they do this because they don't feel that they have any other alternative to actually be truly heard. Because you may have, a CEO who decides to check boxes in their CSR, policies and welcome activists A, B, C. But all parties know that they all have their agenda and nobody is going to change their agenda. So then it's not really a productive exchange. But then by having clashes, especially from the point of view of activists, having clashes in public that's extremely mediatized, that will have a lot of negative impact on the brand of said company or said government, etc. That is the only way they often feel that they have an impact, which obviously is not what those in the private sector or the government would want. So I'm not sure right now that there has been, I haven't seen a very productive way of approaching this, because people on all sides have their agenda that they want to hold and think that they are right and they're more right than the opposite side. But they're definitely aware of each other's agenda. So yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how what the way forward is. But I would say that I think, and I'm probably biased in this, that the activists clashing with powerful stakeholders in the private sector and in government is a productive thing, because it forces powerful companies and governments to find strategies to either address some of the things that they're being accused of, or seem to address it, which in a way is still speaking to the fact that there might be more awareness of certain issues. And I'm fully aware that I'm putting all blame on the private sector and the governments in this case. But yeah, I think that is a productive avenue for the activists.
So there's two other ways that they intersect. One, probably one of the most influential is through shareholders, right? So companies change through what their shareholders want, right? If you're ExxonMobil, your job is to provide shareholder value. And as your investors tell you, hey, we think that we're moving into a post-carbon world, you better start investing in renewable energy and start building businesses that are going to be adapting to this new world. That is what will force companies to move. So that's arguably, I'm not sure I believe this, but arguably a reason not to divest, so that you're a shareholder and you can be an activist shareholder. The other is through regulators, right? So people will lobby Congress, lobby the EPA, lobby some other federal agency or their state, if it's a local issue, and then use government to put pressure on companies to change. In fact, it's not just a domestic thing. One of the most interesting things I've found is that activists in Africa who are upset about a project, particularly like a World Bank project. Let's say there's a World Bank project and they're building a road and it's going to knock down some town. And everyone's promised that they're going to be moved into a nice new town, and the government doesn't do it, or the World Bank doesn't do it. The activists don't complain to the government. Well, they might complain to the government. They don't get anywhere in complaining to the government at home. They will come to the U.S. Congress, and they will go find, there is some congressperson or a staffer to a congressperson who is upset at the World Bank about something, and they will lobby that person, who will then lean on the U.S. Treasury, who will lean on the World Bank. So it sounds like a very weird thing, but the openness of the U.S. Congress and the leverage that the Congress has over institutions like the World Bank through the annual appropriation for IDA means that activists use that avenue to influence the bank. And I've seen it so many times, so many times. So in a sense, the weird, U.S. Congress is a bizarre, dysfunctional institution. But in some ways, its transparency can be a global public good because of that ability. So.
Yep. Any more questions? All right, so on that note, we end our discussion. I'd like you to help me thank Todd and Nadege for that.